from her. The mother of the Keeladin family, a red-haired, middle-aged woman, put her hand to her lips and agreed with Mrs. Mensel's words. She added that they were very lucky to have the girl as Cassius's companion, and she smiled shyly, thanking the woman for these words. The redhead announced that, at the request of the now-deceased Mrs. Margris herself, this funeral would not be gloomy. Looking at Syria's displeased face, the woman said that she had thought very carefully about who to invite, and now she could see many friendly faces at this table. Listening to their non-stop chatter, the blue-eyed girl lowered her head and thought that it was terribly tiring. Looking at the women, the girl thought she had heard that the representatives of the Western houses were typical aristocrats who smiled beautifully, but hid daggers behind their backs. Suddenly, she was told that her ladyship had come down to the table much earlier than she had expected, and Syria asked again what it was all about. Madame Mensel put her arm round her companions and said that, judging by the way the girl had treated Cassius as a servant when she first arrived, she had thought that the Archduchess would be the last to come down to them. The blonde, who was the companion of Syria's half-brother, tried as much as possible to show that they were truly inseparable. In the original book, both Cassius and Nisus will be hopelessly attached to the saint, and when Keladin learns that Lady Mensel will secretly abuse Lena, he will break off the engagement. Throwing her hair back, the blue-eyed girl thought that she had intended to be kinder to the blonde before, since such a miserable fate awaited her. The girl decided to defend her honor and looked up and said that she had absolutely no need for attention. Looking innocently at her unwanted interlocutor, Syria said with a smile that everyone already knew that she was the daughter of Marquis Keladin and the wife of Archduke Berk. Mrs. Mensel's grip on her man's hand tightened as the blue-eyed woman added that there wasn't a single fool here who would act like a child trying to figure out who she was. The blonde wanted to say that she didn't mean it that way, but her stepmother raised her hand and asked Syria with a grin to be more kind, since she was talking to a future family member. When the woman sarcastically asked if they should call the girl her ladyship, she smiled calmly and replied that that would be wonderful. The blue-eyed one said that if they had treated her properly from the beginning, everyone here would have acted accordingly, and the red-haired one chuckled, saying that Syria had really changed a lot. Turning to Marquis Keladin, her father, whom she met for the first time since she came to this world, the girl asked if he agreed with this. The man said you heard her throw a fit, insisting that Jason open the front gate, and then asking if he could ask her not to pester everyone present about following protocol at a time when they had lost a relative. Blue Eyes said that it would have been possible if she had been Keladin, but now Archduchess Berk sat before them. Stretching her back, Syria said that she was accompanied by the knights of this house, led by their commander, so she refused to tolerate any disrespect towards her husband's family name, and did not want to become the cause between the Berks and Keladin. Not expecting to hear such words from his daughter, the dark-haired man looked at her in surprise, his mouth slightly open. Looking away, the man cleared his throat, saying that the girl had really changed, had become completely different. Marquis Keladin squeezed his wineglass, asking if the rumor that she had fainted during the wedding ceremony was true. Syria said that everything was correct, but Nisus suddenly cried out, wondering if his father really believed this, and then called to look at his sister because she was completely fine. The young man stood up and slapped his palms on the table, and then, without lowering his voice, said that he had spoken about the falsehood of the rumors, and there was no need to even try to verify them. Looking at her half-brother, the blue-eyed girl mentally wondered if the Marquis had called her here to personally verify the truth of what he had said. Unwilling to endure it, the girl stood up, leaning against the table, and asked if she had understood correctly that they knew about what had happened, but still did not consider it necessary to send at least one letter to the Berk house. Looking around at her gloomy relatives, the blue-eyed girl asked if they knew what an awkward position they had put her in, and no matter what, she remained the daughter of this family. When Syria said that when she was vomiting blood and was on the verge of death due to her divine power, no one was bothered, the Marquis echoed her words about divine power, asking if it was true. Blue Eyes said that they could ask the commander of the Berk house about everything, who was a respected man and would not lie to anyone. She asked who would lie for her, since, according to her relatives, the girl was clearly not worth it. Later, the Archduchess was walking down the corridor, heated by this unexpected quarrel, when her name was suddenly called. The girl quickly turned around when she felt a strong grip of tenacious fingers on her wrist. Blue Eyes saw Cassius in front of her, and he asked her if she liked making a scandal right after a long absence. Syria objected that she hadn't arranged anything, because she really could have died and simply told the truth, while Nisus insisted otherwise. The girl, offended, told her free brother that he himself had seen Mrs. Mensel's behavior very well, but still saw the problem in her. Feeling herself shaking after meeting all these people, the blue-eyed girl demanded to let her go because she had already said everything. Frightening the dark-haired man with her trembling and ragged breathing, the Archduchess thought that the problem was not in the relationship between the Marquis and his daughter. Most likely, something happened between her and her brother. Cassius asked Saria what was happening to her, and she felt a terrible lack of air, felt dizzy, and again asked to let her go. Not knowing how to bring the girl to her senses, the dark-haired man called her by name and shook her shoulders several times. She turned around, hoarsely begging him to let her go again, and suddenly began to sink down, frightening Kaladin even more than before. The young man knelt down, catching his stepsister so that she would not fall flat on the floor, and froze, feeling her shaking violently. Gasping for breath, Saria was unable to control her emotions and simply tried to cope with the panic, ask him to take his hands away or scream, but her own body did not obey her. When Jason ran up to them, grabbing the young gentleman by the shoulder and pulling him aside, the blue-eyed girl rested her hands on the floor and was finally able to breathe air into her lungs. She looked at her palms in confusion, trying to make up for the lack of oxygen she had received by breathing quickly. The butler shouted at Cassius, asking why he did it again, since the lady was still traumatized by what had happened even now, and the girl had no idea what was going on. The next day, when everything was going on as usual at the Kaladin's estate, Saria was called to the Marquis's office. Blue-eyed stood in front of him and could not forget yesterday's horror of not being able to even scream, and thought that she would have to conduct a little investigation to find out what the butler was talking about. The girl was so lost in thought that she did not immediately respond to her father's call, and so she looked up, twitching slightly. She said that she suddenly had a headache and asked what her father wanted to talk about, but he asked if she had been so badly hurt during the ceremony that even after so much time, she could not come to her senses. The blue-eyed girl exhaled and reminded them that she had already told them everything at the table yesterday. The dark-haired man listened sullenly to his daughter, who said that if he didn't believe her, he could look at the records of the Supreme Church. Saria clasped her gloved hands and said that she also had a question for the Marquis. Recalling her recent conversation with Rush, she wondered why he had not yet responded to the Archduke's request for approval of their marriage. The man asked the servant in surprise what they were talking about and whether they had received any request, and he nervously hesitated, answering in the affirmative. He hesitantly recalled that when Madame Saria left the house, the Marquis had ordered that nothing concerning his daughter should be brought, and he froze in surprise, remembering this. The man stood up and rubbed his neck, muttering that he was canceling the order, and then asked for the letter to be brought to him, since he was sure that he had kept it. Marquis Kaladin slammed the table and declared that he had certainly not ordered this to be done, and the servant stuttered and muttered that young Master Nisus had assured him that there would be no problems. The girl closed her eyes, thinking that the red-haired man hated Saria in the book too, but she had no idea that it was he who actually broke all the ties between her and her father. She sighed and said that she intended to get his consent anyway, since his lordship had saved her during the wedding ceremony. Remembering Rush's actions, the blue-eyed girl added that she owed him her life, and the only way to repay him was to become an impeccable archduchess, and therefore she asks for help. The man sighed, muttering that people change when they are on the brink of death, and assured that he would write the gentleman a letter. Saria asked if she could deliver the consent herself, and the Marquis sat down again, saying that she could do so if she wished. The girl called him father for the first time, adding that she would wait, and could not help but notice some changes in his face after that. Blue Eyes thought about how foreign the word sounded to him, and wondered if the real Saria could have simply called her father Marquis all her life. Later, the Archduchess found herself at the burial site of Mrs. Margrice, which was already decorated with sculptures and surrounded by a carved fence. The girl realized with a hint of despair how many people her stepmother had invited to the funeral, because the place was simply teeming with people. Looking sarcastically at the people talking, the blue-eyed girl couldn't understand whether she was at a market or a funeral, when suddenly she noticed a familiar silhouette in the crowd. As soon as she saw the Marquis of Hanet, the unknown young man asked her forgiveness and wished to take up a little of her time. Saria turned around in agreement, and the stranger said that she had been close to the late Mrs. Margrice, and therefore her heart must be broken. He said the woman had nevertheless ordered that a wake be held at her funeral, and expressed hope that this would not upset the girl even more. Covering her face with a fan, the blue-eyed woman said that he was well informed, but she herself thought that the Marchioness should have told her about this in advance, and she almost put herself in a bad light. The young man said that there would be dancing during the banquet and offered his candidacy in case she had not yet found a partner. Extending his hand, clad in a white glove, to the surprised girl, the stranger said that he had admired her for a long time. Stepping back, Syria said she was grateful for his offer, but asked him to be a little more careful in keeping his distance. Suddenly, the blue-eyed girl felt strange hands on her shoulders, and a familiar voice said that she and the lady had already agreed on this in advance. Marquis Hannett abruptly pulled the stranger's hand away, asking if he had any other business with the lady. Callus was grim, even stern, as he glared at his opponent with his cold blue eyes, and then repeated his question. Frightened by such behavior, the young man hastened to answer that there was nothing like that anymore, and waved his hand, moving away from them. The fair-haired man asked her to be careful, saying that there were plenty of those here who were attracted by the glory of Stirna, and the blue-eyed one threw his hand off her shoulder, saying that she knew all about it. The girl said that she could introduce herself, so he had better mind his own business, and the Marchioness, who suddenly appeared, said that Syria had already found the young man. Smiling brightly, the stepmother added that this was a great success, because she was worried that the blue-eyed girl would not be able to find a suitable partner for today's dance. Both young men turned around when the red-haired woman said that the Marquis of Hannett was the most suitable partner for the Archduchess. The girl asked why this was, and the stepmother answered with a smile that none of the other men here matched her level. Thinking about how fortunate she was to have brought Sir Elliot with her, the girl calmly assured him that she already had a partner. The stepmother's smile faltered slightly when Syria said that she would dance with the commander of the Knights of House Burke. While the surrounding ladies laughed like hyenas, the Marquise said that the Marquis was still more suitable for her status, clearly trying to make a scandal out of nothing. Taking a step directly towards the woman, the blue-eyed one muttered that she understood her stepmother's intentions of dragging her into the scene by linking her to the Marquis of Hannett, but if she was eager to take out her anger on someone, it should be her husband. The redhead froze at such impudence and opened her bright yellow eyes in surprise. The girl walked away from all the people, looking at the cemetery, which was already covered with bright leaves falling from the maple. When the Marquis called her by name, the blue-eyed one reminded him that they were being watched and asked him to address her as he should, and Callus asked Madame Stirna not to pay attention to her stepmother. Thinking that her former lover was not going to acknowledge the status of the Archduchess, she muttered that they would play along with her request so that the honor of the Marquise would be saved. The blonde man sighed and said that she was very generous towards this woman. Looking after the red-haired girl, Syria openly reproached the young man, saying that she knew how difficult it was to control oneself after her husband's betrayal. Snorting, she asked irritably if they had discussed everything, wanting to get rid of Callus's company. The Marquis was silent, looking at her fragile silhouette from behind, and the girl said that now, on this point, they needed to end this conversation. The young man looked down with an unhappy expression as his former lover and fiancé walked calmly and leisurely ahead. Later, Syria sat with her relatives at the will-giving ceremony, and the visiting priest thanked them for attending the event. All the children of the Kelladon family nodded when they heard that all of Lady Margaret's property had been divided among its rightful heirs. The Marquis asked his daughter if what she had chosen was enough for her, and the girl quickly replied that the land contract was not a trifle at all. While the blue-eyed girl was holding the papers in her hands, the dark-haired man said that those lands were not just expensive plains, they were polluted with demonic energy. He asked her if she wanted to take the coral island that Nisus had chosen, or the ruby necklace that Cassius had chosen, and both young men looked at her with displeasure. Clutching the scroll, the blue-eyed woman asked with a smile what could be more intriguing for Stirna than lands with demonic energy. In fact, in the novel, the lands were chosen by Cassius and then presented to Saint Lena, who used divine power to purify them. After much work on putting the territories in order, she discovered a hidden mine with valuable magic crystals. The girl thought that she should take advantage of this opportunity, and if she used her necklace, then her power would be enough for purification. Nisus exhaled and suddenly asked what the point of abandoned lands was, and the Archduchess cursed mentally in irritation. She immediately exhaled loudly and closed her eyes, thinking that she shouldn't pay attention because it wouldn't do any good, and her head would just hurt from arguing. Looking at her half-brothers, Syria thought that both Nisus and Cassian had looked depressed since yesterday, and she mentally wondered what could have happened. Brushing aside all these thoughts, the blue-eyed girl remembered with a smile that she only had 3 days left to hold out here, and then she would be able to return home. Later, Marquis Callus's servant stood near the locked door of his chambers, reminding him that the banquet would soon begin, and he had already been sitting in his bedroom for a very long time. The young man sat in the darkness, engulfed in darkness, breathing heavily, hiding his face in his hands so as not to reveal his state of health. Remembering his conversation with Syria today, he couldn't understand how the blue-eyed girl dared to say something like that, and how she could look at him with such a look. Feeling his entire inner being resisting this, Hannett was sure that he had no intention of saving his marriage with Lena, and had been waiting for his ex-fiancée all this time. The copy of the blonde man, made of darkness and teeming with it, asked with a smile if he hated Syria and if he could bear his own hatred. Callus clutched his hair in his hands as the voice sneered that she had betrayed him and deserved to die for it, and he echoed it. When the copy ordered him to kill the girl several times, he froze, swallowed quietly, and tried to resist. Shadow reminded him of how Syria looked at him with disdain, and asked if he wanted to let Stern escape from him so easily forever. The fair-haired man immediately raised his head and stuttered, replying that he never wanted that again. Holding the fountain pen and looking at its tip, the Marquis of Hannett echoed that it would be better to kill his former lover. Suddenly, his gaze caught on a bracelet with a shining blue crystal, which the girl had once given him. Then she gently fastened the jewelry on his wrist and stroked his strong hand with her fingers, saying that it was a wedding gift. Struggling with his inadequate emotions, the young man hit himself with the tip of the fountain pen and exhaled loudly, grabbing it. Breathing heavily, he covered his face with his hands and feverishly whispered whether it would be better for him to kill Syria. The fair-haired man got dirty in his own blood, asking himself if he had really gone completely mad and would seem like a real madman to anyone from the outside. The young man sat in his chambers all alone and could only think about Syria and their relationship. The girl, ready for the ball, opened the doors of her chambers after knocking and quietly clicked her tongue, noticing a less than desirable face in the corridor. Nisus, also fully prepared and dressed in a gray-green tunic, asked what this reaction was and why his sister was looking at him as if he were a worm. The blue-eyed girl asked what he was doing there and where the Marquis of Hannah was, and the red-haired man replied that he had urgent business, so he would replace her partner. The young gentleman asked with displeasure what she had said to him when they met, because after that, Callus was not at all the same as usual. Thinking that his half-sister might now ask for details, Nisus covered his face with his hand and shook his head, asking her to forget about it. The Archduchess wondered if the young man was curious about whether Callus still had feelings for her, and that would not be surprising. Among the aristocrats, there is an opinion that the blame for the break in this engagement lies with the Marquis of Callus, although, of course, there are also rumors that the groom got tired of the girl and ran away. Sighing, Nisus asked why his stepsister had frozen and extended his hand to her, blushing slightly, then said that he would accompany her. At the banquet that was held, there were also a lot of people who were talking and laughing among themselves, discussing the latest news. Syria thought that Mrs. Margris probably meant a small celebration for the closest people, and not a large-scale ball, but the red-haired man suddenly asked if she wanted to dance. Turning around, the blue-eyed girl quietly hissed and asked her stepbrother if he had simply gone crazy. Nisus stepped towards the girl and asked if she really intended to stand there until the very end, and Syria folded her arms across her chest, reminding her that her first dance would be with the commanding knight of House Burke. The red-haired man asked where he was, since no one had seen him yet, and the blue-eyed woman turned away and smiled slyly, thinking that this was not surprising, since in order to avoid dancing, the Archduchess asked Abi to make it so that the butler could not hand Sir Elliot a suit for the banquet. She said that she did not need to be accompanied, and that her brother could go about his business, but the young gentleman replied that he would gladly do so if he could. The red-haired man said that someone told his father about him, and now, as punishment, he has to stay with his half-sister for the rest of the day. The girl smiled brightly, asking if this was really about Nisus's order to throw away the Archduke's letter. Their conversation was interrupted by the rest of the family, and Cassius discontentedly told the blue-eyed girl not to act like a child, but to finally dance with her half-brother. She turned an irritated and tired look to the dark-haired man, reminding him of her words spoken earlier. Syria said that she was not going to give Nisus her first dance, and the older half-brother was already starting to boil, not hiding it. His companion, the same blonde, put her hand to her chest, saying that she could not understand why her ladyship was behaving this way. She added that it was not enough for the blue-eyed one to humiliate the Marquis of Hannett by publicly rejecting his offer to accompany her to this ball. The Archduchess exhaled loudly because no one present was hiding what they were saying, and everything was once again threatening to turn into a scandal. On either side of them, the aristocrats began to whisper with interest about how Sterna was once again making a scene in front of everyone. When Mrs. Menzel said that even for an archduchess such behavior was too much, the blue-eyed girl pressed her hand to her chest and muttered nervously. Suddenly, appearing in festive attire, Marquise Hannett asked the blonde why she assumed that he was humiliated by the lady's words. The fair-haired man stood in front of Syria, saying that he was simply unwell, and asked her ladyship for some time to rest and recover. As he spoke, gracefully waving his arms and using his knowledge of aristocrats, the girl noticed that his hand was bandaged. Looking at the blonde with disgust and irritation, Callis said that it was rather these words that humiliated him. The Marquise suddenly asked them to stop, asking if they had all forgotten that they were there to honor the departed Madame Marguerite. She looked at her stepdaughter and said that she understood her feelings, and then asked if she could at least dance with Cassius, since she had rejected Nisus. Sari felt like she was about to explode from the inside due to the overwhelming anger, and she breathed loudly, trying to maintain her composure in such a crowd. Blue-eyed glanced around at the crowd of aristocrats who were capable of dismissing the servants, and the stepmother added that the funeral banquet could not be allowed to end on such a note. Marquis Hannett began to speak again, but the girl stepped forward and said that he did not need to intercede for her. Deciding that she could not allow further spread of dirty rumors and gossip about her person, she looked at the Marquise with hatred and said that she agreed. The Archduchess asked for a little time to prepare and left. Then, while changing her shoes, muttered that both her former fiancé and her stepmother had a special talent for turning everything upside down. Exhaling, she said regretfully that she would very much like to return home, and the door of the chambers swung open. Cassius entered without much enthusiasm and stated that his half-sister seemed to find their family company a burden. Walking towards the girl, the young gentleman said irritably that she could have shown him at least a little respect, not made him look bad in front of everyone. Syria folded her arms across her chest and turned away, stating that she had already shown them a lot of respect when she agreed to let him dance with her. The blue-eyed girl said that if he came to quarrel, then he had better leave, but the dark-haired man suddenly grabbed her hand. Pulling the girl towards himself and forcing her to stand up, Cassius shouted that as soon as he touched her, she almost lost consciousness. Exhaling loudly, the Archduchess ordered her release, looking at the young man with irritation and contempt. Celadon, continuing to hold her hand, suddenly asked why she hated him so much, and whether the reason for it was what happened in their distant past. Immediately deciding to take advantage of the opportunity and find out about what had happened from the dark-haired man himself, Syria excitedly asked why he had done this to her. Having let go of his half-sister, Cassius screamed, trying to understand how long she would remind him of this accident, since she herself agreed to keep everything a secret. Thinking that she needed to press him a little more, the blue-eyed girl rubbed her fingers over her wrist and said sarcastically that he had definitely already forgotten what he had done. Trying to understand what Cassius was most afraid of and from whom he would like to hide this act, the girl asked if he really thought that ignoring the problem would solve it. Hitting the nail on the head, Syria finished him off with the question of whether his father would believe that what happened was an accident if he found out. The dark-haired man reached out to her and squeezed her fragile shoulders with tenacious fingers, breathing heavily and feeling panic after his stepsister's words. He shouted angrily and loudly at the girl, asking if she understood what the consequences of this act would be. Blue-eyed again felt the rising panic from his annoying touches and tried to hide her fear from her stepbrother. She clenched her fists, screaming that she had to go and see her father right now to get rid of his mood swings. Cassius crossed the line and pushed her back, sitting her on the sofa and squeezing her thin shoulders until they were uncomfortable, and warned her that she should not trifle with him. Hearing screams from the corridor, the butler burst into the room and called both the mistress and the master, trying to reason with them and appeal to their senses. He fell on top of the dark-haired man and grabbed him with his arms to tear him away from the girl and screamed, begging Mrs. Syria for forgiveness for the gentleman. Cassius stood up abruptly and pushed the gray-haired man off of him, and Syria fell to the floor, off balance after he abruptly threw his hands off of her. Walking towards the door and breathing heavily, he again threw vile words at his sister about her being madly fixated on her past life and walked away. Sitting on the floor and trying to come to her senses, the blue-eyed girl looked at the butler Jason and asked him to explain to her what mistake Cassius had made in the past. Later, when the Marquis' heir stood on the balcony, looking down on the proceedings, he heard his half-sister call his name. Walking straight towards him in only one shoe and stepping on the other foot, covered in blood, the girl asked how he dared to run away in a rage. Hugging herself with her arms, the blue-eyed woman gloomily reminded that they had not finished the conversation, and Cassius asked what else there was to discuss. She said that Jason told her everything, and revealed the very terrible secret that he had been keeping for so long. Syria clarified that she was talking about everything that happened 10 years ago on that cold winter night, and the young man froze. The butler said that she and Mr. Nisus had slipped away to the frozen lake behind the estate, apparently to play and have fun. But then the red-haired boy came to his father in tears and declared that he did not want to be with his sister and live with her in the same house. He covered his face with his hands and sobbed, repeating that he didn't like having her around while the young Marquis sat in front of him, kneeling. The man asked his son sullenly if that was why he had decided to leave his sister alone on the frozen lake. The Marquis was furious, and Lord Cassius and the others joined Jason in the search, which began immediately, so that the little lady would not freeze to death. The young man, holding a lantern in his hand and calling his sister by name, was the first of all those who took part in the search to stumble upon her. Little Syria was lying in the snow, already covered with fresh white flakes, and was freezing. And when she noticed the dark-haired man, she desperately called out to him, unable to cope with her chattering teeth. The gentleman said that he was afraid to show the girl to the Marquis in such a state, so as not to bring an even more severe punishment on his brother, and temporarily decided to hide his little sister. But the ice at the place where Cassius had laid the child's head face down, as if by an unfortunate accident, cracked. Syria found herself in icy water, unable to breathe, her lungs burning from the lack of oxygen, her nose burning from the water, and her face prickling with hundreds of tiny needles from the cold. Listening to the butler, the blue-eyed girl froze, her eyes wide open, because she expected anything, but definitely not such a terrible incident. Jason lowered his head and said desperately that it was an accident. The gentleman had simply made a mistake in his youth and had not noticed the crack in the ice. Ignoring the people who were happily dancing at the ball, Syria said that the butler told her this, but the girl's own memories returned. She revealed that Cassius had deliberately put her head in the water and tried to kill her, and then added that it didn't matter how small he was, because it didn't stop him from seeing the child choke. When her half-brother called her by her first name and old surname, the blue-eyed girl turned away, shaking her head and saying that he still continued to use that surname in relation to her. Stepping forward, she asked if she had not been an archduchess, he would also have wanted to dance with her at this memorial party. Syria placed her hand on the railing and asked if he would even answer any of her questions if she were an ordinary marquise. The girl vaguely understood the girl's emotions, but even without the memories of that winter night, she often had the feeling of being pushed into a dark, frozen lake. No matter how much she suffered even as an adult, nothing helped. She still felt like she couldn't take that saving breath. She was often haunted by the feeling of imminent death, but it turned out that they had already tried to kill her so vilely in the past. Looking at Cassius's face, she suddenly remembered the boy she had seen in front of her on that very nightmarish day, and again felt a lack of air. She tried to breathe, but no oxygen entered her lungs, and the blue-eyed girl cringed, beginning to stagger. Feeling her consciousness leaving her, the girl fell backwards, but there was no collision with the hard floor because Rush's strong arms caught her in time. The Archduke looked with excitement at his wife, who had left their shared estate in perfect health and now was suddenly falling off her feet. Raising her blue eyes filled with tears to her beloved husband, she whispered his name and thought that he was the only one who saved her time and time again. The man was still in shock, not expecting to find his wife in such a state, when she seemed to relax in his arms, trusted him, and completely lost consciousness. Everyone present at the memorial ball looked around when they heard the Archduke calling his wife by name and asking her to wake up. Rush was terribly scared, and he also reproached himself terribly for letting Syria come here alone, without his accompaniment. A few days ago, she asked him if he was worried about letting her go alone, and the man replied that he didn't know that was possible until now. She leaned towards his ear and whispered that if he was worried, he could fulfill her request and take his wife away from the Keladins. The fair-haired man asked in surprise what she wanted, and Syria explained that if the Archduke himself showed up, all her relatives would be very scared. Blushing, the blue-eyed girl said that it would be easier for her to survive this trip if she knew that in the end he would come for her and take her away. Stroking his beloved's cheek, Rush whispered that he had come a long way to take her home, but who could have known that she would end up in such a state? Ready to say goodbye to life, Cassius, stuttering, tried to ask how the Duke ended up there, but he lifted his wife into his arms. Pressing her tightly to his chest, the Archduke looked up at him, filled with rage, and in a seething voice asked the dark-haired man what he had done to his wife. Later, Syria slowly came to her senses, forcing her eyes open and feeling sweat on her forehead, and realized that she was sitting in a soft chair. Rush, kneeling in front of her, washing the blood from her foot, raised his head, noticing the movement, and asked excitedly how she was feeling. Jumping up and leaning forward, the girl asked in surprise when he had arrived, since she had not expected him in the next 3 days. Wiping her leg with a soft cloth, the Archduke said that he could no longer bear their separation, and so he set off earlier than planned. Gently stroking her skin, the man reminded her that he had asked her to be careful, but his duchess seemed to have failed. Syria lowered her head and quietly exhaled, asking her husband for forgiveness because she had torn him away from his plans. Rush said that if the girl was truly sorry, then she should tell him the truth about what Cassius did. Smiling a little nervously, the blue-eyed girl said that he wouldn't like this story, and it happened a long time ago. The man countered that the Laurel Estate's problems were also long-standing, but they had resolved them, and Syria said that it wasn't that big of a deal. Looking at her reflection in the basin of water, the blue-eyed girl muttered that it was just a trifle, and he would laugh at her inability to figure out such a trifle. As he continued to fix her leg, Rush said that no matter what anyone said, the fact remained that she had failed to overcome some moment in her past. Looking seriously at his wife, the man repeated again that everything connected with her was very important to him. Syria gripped the upholstery of the chair with her fingers and exhaled, saying that she had learned how, as a child, Cassius had tried to drown her in the lake behind the house. It seemed as if this confession, spoken in a completely casual tone, froze in the air and echoed several times in the Archduke's head. He didn't have time to say anything, because the doors of the chambers swung open, and Syria's stepmother entered with her 2 sons. Rush, sitting on bent legs in front of his wife, raised his stern gaze, looked at the woman, and asked what was the matter. The Marchioness said that he had honored their home with his presence, and therefore they were obliged to greet him properly, and Nisus quietly asked his brother why the Archduke had knelt before the girl. Getting up from the floor, the fair-haired man asked again what they wanted, and his tone, despite its cold-bloodedness, quite clearly instilled fear in the hearts of those present. Turning to the Kelladon family, he tried to find his wife's half-brother with his eyes, and said that this was very opportune, because they just needed to discuss something. Once outside, Cassius asked what his lordship meant, and was immediately hit in the face with a black glove. Rush, trying to contain his rising anger, said that he had expressed himself clearly enough that even a slow-witted person like him would understand everything perfectly the first time. Taking a firm grip on his sword and drawing it from its sheath, the man raised his head and repeated that he was challenging the heir of the Marquis of Kelladon to a duel. Stroking his bruised cheek with his hand, the dark-haired man said that even though his opponent was an archduke, it didn't change the oddity of him bringing him beyond the lake. Cassius added that he did not know what Syria had told her husband, but Rush interrupted him, categorically declaring that he had not allowed his wife's name to be spoken. Directing his bright red eyes, burning with the flame of rage, at the face of the lost Kelladon, the fair-haired man asked if he really needed to cut out his tongue if he couldn't cope with it. Also drawing his sword, Cassius thought that now the Archduke would be angered by every word he said, and therefore he should simply fight back. He didn't even have time to fully free his sword, because Rush flew up to him, swinging at his opponent, but not with the tip, but with its hilt. The man, not wanting to stand on ceremony any longer, as no one had stood on ceremony with his wife, hit the dark-haired man on the head with a loud bang. Groaning several times from the sharp pain, the young Marquis fell backwards and buried his face in the crook of his elbow to cope with the dizziness that had come over him. The blond man came closer, and with all his strength stepped on the ankle of the already affected Cassius, causing him to scream loudly in pain. Thrusting his sword into the ice that covered the lake, right next to the boy's face, Rush shattered it in a few blows, releasing the cold water. Sitting down next to him, the Archduke lifted the Marquis from the ground, grabbing him by the hair with his hand and examining his frightened face with traces of blood. The blond man asked Kelladon to take a deep breath with a smile, because it would be very uninteresting and boring if he just died quickly. The man pulled the young man right to the ice hole and pushed his head under the water, tightly squeezing his dark hair with his fingers. Little Syria was the only thorn in their family's side, and Cassia had always been irritated by the fact that she somehow bore their last name ever since she appeared. When the girl was rescued, he still looked at her and thought that her appearance was a mistake that none of them could erase now. While the little lady was being dried with towels and wrapped in blankets, she didn't even blink an eye, even though she had just recently been drowning in the lake. The teenager, standing next to Jason, wondered in his mind if it was pride that prevented her from telling everyone what had happened. Looking at her blank expression, he thought that the girl might have realized that telling this story was useless, because no one would believe her. Regretting that he had not finished the job, he looked at the child and cursed her, never tired of dreaming that one day she would disappear from their lives. And now he felt with his face and lungs, with his whole body, the same icy fire that the small and fragile Saria had once felt, unable to resist. Rush sat on top of him, squeezing his hand with his free hand and methodically drowning him, not allowing him to take his head out of the water for a moment. The Marchioness approached and saw everything that had happened and, in horror, covered her face with her hands, screaming the name of her son. The blue-eyed girl who was following her also froze and opened her eyes in surprise, dropping her jaw, unable to believe what was happening. The girl remembered how 15 minutes ago Rush casually asked his wife not to worry and assured her that they would just talk. Now that there was a commotion in the street and they went to see what was going on, she saw something more than just a fight or a dangerous duel. When Ibi covered her shoulders with a cape, the mistress covered her mouth with her hand, feeling retribution, and thought that this sight was the most amazing in her life. The Marchioness put her hand on her shoulder and hysterically asked her if she was really going to stand there while her husband went crazy and ordered her to do something. Saria calmly muttered that she had no right to interfere since they were having a duel and it was forbidden. Looking back, the blue-eyed girl said with undisguised pleasure that even in a different case, she would not have done anything. The Marquise grabbed her by the arm, dragging her forward, and shouted that, if necessary, the girl would kneel and beg Rush to stop. Saria gasped at the sharp pain in her leg, and the girl stopped as the Marquise's knight caught the glove thrown at his mistress. The green-eyed fighter with long hair tied in a ponytail asked Abigail how she dared to disrespect a woman so much. Abby, furious and almost burning with hellish fire from rage, said that she was challenging him to a duel. Taking the sword out of its sheath, the girl added that for such an attitude towards the Archduchess, he would be forced to pay with his own head. Saria tried to prevent another armed clash, but the knight made a fatal mistake and said that after her loss, Ibi should not regret the words she spoke. The desperate brave man was defeated, knocked out and sprawled on the ground in just a few seconds. Waving to her mistress, the dark-haired one joyfully called her and said, sharing her joy, that she had finished very quickly. Muttering that she felt a little ill, the Marquise placed her hand on her forehead and, unable to bear so much shame, fainted. Later, while drying his wet hair with a towel, Rush asked in bewilderment why the Marquise had suddenly lost consciousness. Sitting on the bed, Saria explained that Ebby knows how to put pressure on someone so that they would be in serious shock. Both the Marquise and her son, Cassius, were carried away by servants to receive medical attention inside the estate. The girl covered her mouth with a smile and said that her heart had not been so light for a long time, and the Archduke asked if that was really enough. Turning to his dear wife, Rush calmly said that if Saria had simply wished, he would have killed Cassius on that very spot. Blue-Eyed straightened up when she heard his words and said that murder was not a joke, but the man shook his head, saying that it was not a joke. The Archduke immediately added that his brother had attempted to take her life, and therefore he would not even think twice before finishing him off. The girl looked at her husband in amazement, who said that if he had to choose what to do, he would declare war on the Kelladons, filling this entire damned lake with their bodies. She gently placed her palms on his clenched fists and called her husband's name, gently stroking his skin. Surprising the man, Saria said that when he said that the past had to be lived through, she immediately stopped caring about this terrible situation. The blue-eyed girl simply blossomed when she remembered that he didn't try to convince her that it was just an accident, didn't accuse her of being overly emotional, didn't pretend that everything was fine, but took her side. Smiling, she leaned closer to him and thanked Rush for freeing her from her past. The Archduke blossomed into a smile and warm emotion when his wife added that her gratitude was sincere. The man gently replied that he was glad to help, but the blue-eyed girl looked at his face strangely. She turned to him and touched her husband's face with her fingers, thinking that she had never noticed that little wrinkle on his face when he smiled before. Rush, although enjoying the unexpected warm touch, was surprised and quietly called his wife by name. Immediately, as if waking up from a dream, Saria jumped away from him and raised her hands, nervously shouting that she must have been overtired during the day. She cleared her throat and climbed onto the bed, kicking off her slippers and muttering that it was time for them to go to bed. The girl exhaled, saying that she needed to get up early tomorrow to have time to prepare for leaving home, and caught herself thinking that she was not at all embarrassed to sleep in the same bed with him. Blushing brightly at this thought, she squeezed the pendant with her fingers, realizing how close she and Rush had become. The next day, all the knights were already loading the collected things into the carriage of the Archduke and his wife in the morning. The girl stood in front of her father and said that they would have to leave today because her husband had a lot of things to take care of at home. Exhaling, the dark-haired man put his folded hands under his chin and asked Syria to honestly tell him what Cassius had managed to do yesterday. The blue-eyed girl exhaled loudly when the Marquis said that he did not want to deal with the consequences of what happened and not know the situation at the same time. Raising her piercing gaze to her father, the girl decided that there was no point in hiding it and told him that as a child, Cassius had tried to kill her. Ready for anything, but definitely not for this. Marquis Keladon straightened up, looking in surprise at his daughter, whose words he did not want to believe. Syria asked him if he remembered the night about 10 years ago when she, as a little girl, was lost because of Nisus. The girl said that Cassius lowered her head into the lake and held it so that she could not escape from under the water. That is, he wanted to kill her. The man stood up and looked at her in surprise when the blue-eyed woman said that he could ask Jason too, since he knew about it too. The Marquis slammed the table and screamed, not understanding why she had been silent all this time, why she couldn't at least mention it. Syria explained that after the accident at the wedding ceremony, she lost a good half of all her life memories. She added that her butler Jason reminded her of the incident, and her father stared at his daughter in disbelief, asking if that was why she had changed so much. After answering that it was possible, the blue-eyed girl said that she also had a question, and then asked when she was brought to this estate. After thinking for a while and sitting in silence, the man replied that she was, I think, 3 or 4 years old at the time. Nodding towards the wall, she noted with a grin that she was the only member of the family who had not been honored to be painted in this portrait. Syria said that they started working on him while she was still living with them, and so she became convinced that her father was no different from the rest of the family. Turning around and walking towards the exit, the blue-eyed girl sighed and expressed the hope that she would no longer have a reason to meet him. Ignoring her father's call, she went out into the corridor and closed the door behind her, immediately leaning her back against it, exhausted. She smiled softly only when Rush suddenly approached, called her by name and gently took her hand, squeezing her thin fingers. Answering the question about what he would do here, the Archduke said with a smile that he had come to accompany his precious Archduchess. Meanwhile, Cassius, having heard the news from Jason, cried out indignantly, not understanding what Callus's unwillingness to communicate with him could mean. The butler said that the Knights of the House of Burke had apparently accidentally told the Marquis about what had happened on the frozen lake. When the man said that the Marquis had been overtaken by rumors, the dark-haired man pointed his finger at him and ordered that all this be settled immediately. The young man cried out that only Hannett knew about it so far, and that later all the aristocrats who had attended the memorial banquet could find out, and his mother stroked her forehead, exhaling. He said it would be a scandal if everyone found out how he tried to drown Syria, and his younger brother Nisus stood in the doorway, stunned. The redhead stepped into the room and asked if this had really happened 10 years ago, and Cassius turned away, muttering that it was none of his brother's business. He screamed in shock, asking if it was really not an accident that she fell into the water, but rather that it was his doing. Offering to talk frankly, the dark-haired one justified himself by saying that this only happened because Nisus left her at the lake, saying that the girl irritated him. The young gentleman shouted that he was simply trying to get back into the house, but he would never have done that to a small child. And then he remembered how Cassius had used his sister's status for his own purposes when he found out that she was Sterna. Squeezing the back of the sofa on which her eldest heir was sitting with her hands, clad in lace gloves, she ordered him to stop. She asked her second son if he really wanted to make Cassius's life difficult by revealing the secret of his past. The woman added that what happened would greatly affect their position in society, and therefore it would be more useful for Nisus to think about how to fix everything. The red-haired man rubbed his face with his hand, saying that he didn't know anything and hated his sister for avoiding them, always wanting to teach them a lesson. He was horrified to think how badly he had treated this innocent little girl all these years. Looking at his relatives, he declared that all of them, he, his mother, and his brother, had all gone mad with hatred. Ignoring his mother's cries for him to return, Nisus turned and walked out of the chambers, running down the corridor. After some time, Syria was already home and was again examining the glacier, and Lenin, who was constantly reporting some news, called her. Breathing heavily and resting his hands on his knees, the assistant said that checking the glacier every day immediately after returning from the Keladons was a bit excessive. Blue-Eyed replied with a smile that these were her duties, which she and the Tau had briefly abandoned, and besides, her character would not allow her to rest peacefully. The fair-haired man asked the lady why, when looking at her, he remembered students exhausted by grueling studies and the demands of old professors, and the girl involuntarily remembered her past life. Lennon reminded her that she had recently returned from a long trip and asked why she didn't take a couple of days off. He pointed his hand at the lady's accompanying knight and noticed that Abigail still seemed to be recovering from her fatigue. The dark-haired one said that it was nonsense, asking rhetorically what kind of knight would feel tired when his mistress was nearby. She immediately ran away quickly, shouting that she was as cheerful as a cucumber, and declared that she would go and explore the surrounding area. Syria noted nervously that sometimes Evie didn't seem human at all, and Lennon muttered that he was even glad about it. Suddenly saying that this was not a joke, he said that non-human races, elves, mermaids, and the like still exist. The blue-eyed girl asked if he had heard of alien life forms, and the blonde-haired man quickly replied that he had come on business. He said that his lordship had a day off for the first time in a long time, so he would like to have dinner with his wife. The girl said that of course she would come, and then asked why Lennon was smiling so strangely. Turning away, the assistant replied that the couple had not spent a long time together on holiday, and that this evening could end differently. Blushing brightly, Syria indignantly asked how he could say that, since she was simply invited to eat, and nothing like that could happen. Much later in the evening, a girl who was already quite drunk dropped a glass of wine on the table. She hiccuped, lowering her head, and Rush called her name, a little surprised. Holding a similar crystal glass in his hand, the Archduke asked, a little sullenly, if she had already drunk enough. The blue-eyed girl, stuttering a little, said that this was not so and that she was fine, and then declared that she could even read. Taking the bottle in her hands, she began to read incoherently that the label contained gratitude from the Empire, and the man replied that it seemed she had had enough. The fair-haired man said with a kind smile that he was impressed by the girl's stamina, since she had been drinking since the very beginning of dinner, and the blue-eyed girl repeated again that she was not drunk. Brightly blushing and tipsy, Syria said that it was simply so delicious, and it was hard to resist. While Rush sipped his drink with a soft smile, the blue-eyed girl said that he was drinking too, but doing well. Hearing his chuckle, she asked what was so funny, and added that he was right, and that he should be drunker than her. The girl picked up the bottle and said she had had a little while, but her husband had finished most of it, but was still sober. Agreeing with his wife's words, the Archduke asked her to give him the vessel, otherwise she would definitely drop it. Syria thought grimly that this was all really strange, not understanding how he could be less drunk than her. Suddenly, finishing this thought out loud, the girl screamed that she thought Rush had a glass of grape juice instead of wine. The man froze in surprise, spreading his arms out to the sides, and asked what she meant, and the blue-eyed girl gasped, realizing that she had said it and not thought it. The blonde man stood up and pushed his chair back, walking around the table, and offered to let her see for herself if she was interested. Holding out a glass of wine to his tipsy wife, he said that they were exactly the same. Wanting to check, Syria pulled the glass towards herself and suddenly spilled the drink, coughing quietly. Not really in control of her actions in this state, she turned away from the glass and knocked it out of Rush's hand. All the red wine ended up on the Archduke's perfectly white shirt, and the crystal hit the floor but did not break. Suddenly, sobering up a bit, the blue-eyed woman reached out to her husband and asked for forgiveness, and the man replied that there was nothing wrong with that. Touching the blonde man's chest with her palms, the girl said that he was all wet and needed to take it off. The Archduke agreed and said that he would change his clothes, but the blue-eyed girl said that she would do it herself. She suddenly began to unbutton his shirt herself, hastily clinging to the buttons with her fingers while her husband called her name. Catching her fragile hand by the wrist, Rush blushed and repeated that everything was completely fine. Syria blushed brightly and looked straight at her husband, freezing when she felt the touch of his strong hand. The blonde-haired man leaned towards the girl and intertwined their fingers, exhaling loudly, and this embarrassed her. He touched his thumb to his beloved's lower lip and asked her to tell him she didn't want it now, and he could stop. The Archduke gently stroked her face, causing the blue-eyed girl's heart to beat even faster in her chest. Looking at his face, she couldn't decide what to do, because it seemed like she had to refuse. Syria knew that it was better to reject him now, but she didn't have the strength. Her lips were drawn to each other along with their hearts. Merging into a hot kiss over and over again, and not wanting to break it, they both breathed heavily and moaned. Not receiving a refusal, Rush, whose mind was clouded by alcohol, grabbed his wife by the waist and sat her down on the table. Feeling the man's cheeky kisses on her cheek and neck, the blue-eyed girl exhaled loudly and pressed her palms against his chest. The blonde-haired man exhaled loudly into his beloved's lips, feeling the touch of her fingers, which inflamed him even more. Rush pulled back a little, and not hiding his hoarse voice and tension, asked if she was doing this on purpose. Hastily removing her hand, the girl blushed brightly and said that it was not at all on purpose. They touched foreheads, breathing heavily, and Syria muttered that his shirt was wet, which was why her touch felt that way. The blue-eyed girl waved her hand slightly, and the bottle of wine standing on the table shook and fell down. The young people were immediately distracted, came to their senses a little, and turned around to the noise and ringing. The glass shattered when it hit the floor, and the expensive bright red wine spilled, running across the tiles. With his head down and his hands resting on the table, Rush sighed and said that he would no longer drink with her. Syria asked if it was because of the spilled drink, and the blonde man whispered almost into her very lips that it was not at all. He openly said that he had never had such a strong desire to get the approval of their marriage from the imperial family as he did now. A few days later, soft snowflakes dusted the roofs and spires as discussions took place in the Archduke's office. Syria folded her hands together, smiling brightly when she learned that the knights had agreed to go with her to pacify the monsters on the Cornez plain. Lenin explained that, in principle, this did not require their consent. On the contrary, these fighters should thank her for this opportunity. Blue-Eyed replied that she was also grateful to the knights, and that she had many things in her plans that needed to be checked there. She thought that if they cleared these lands, they could secure the passage to the cave with magic crystals. The girl pressed her hand to her lips with a bright smile, and thought about how perfect this plan was. Catching Rush's gaze once more, Syria turned and asked her husband why he was staring at her like that. He removed his hand from his chin and calmly stated that he was not staring at anything, but simply looking. The man asked why she was reacting like that, and the girl pressed her palms against her skirt and said sullenly that there was no point in denying it. She pouted, thinking that he had been staring at her ever since she entered the office. Rush rubbed his chin with his hand, calmly apologizing and saying that he must have just been captivated by her beauty. Syria and Lenin both stared at the gentleman in surprise, not expecting such an expression of emotion in private. The assistant leaned towards the lady, whispering what had happened between the two of them yesterday, and the girl, blushing, whispered that nothing of the sort. Getting up from the sofa, the blue-eyed girl firmly decided that she would never get drunk like that again. The Archduke asked in surprise where she was going, and his wife, puffing, replied that she would begin preparing for her expedition. Turning around, the flushed girl demanded that he stop staring at her and say that he would be better off helping the knights with their preparations. When the door closed behind the lady, Lenin immediately turned to Rush, asking if he could find out what happened yesterday, but the man interrupted him, refusing. Soon, Syria went to explore the plains she had received, walking through the snowy land, and Abigail immediately caught up and called out to her. After saluting, the girl said that it was an honor for her to accompany her mistress, and the blue-eyed girl, with a soft smile, replied that she was also glad about it. The girl said that on the map the plain looks small, but in reality it feels simply enormous. Turning around, Abigail became more serious than before, asking Syria to be very careful, because the knight said that people did not dare to come here because of the monsters. She wanted to start explaining something else, but suddenly another knight ran up to them, calling her ladyship. The girls turned around and froze when they heard that monsters had been spotted nearby. As the boy folded in half, breathing heavily and trying to collect his thoughts, Syria approached him, asking how many there were and in what direction. He explained that here, behind the hill, they surrounded the carriage and attacked some travelers from ambush. The unbridled monsters, who had not encountered resistance for a long time, surrounded the carriage from all sides. The pink-haired lady sitting in the carriage screamed loudly, asking someone for help. The monster's huge paw rested on the carriage window and smashed it to get the desired prey. As the monster surrounded the captured girl, growling in rage, she screamed shrilly, wanting to break free. Several knights of the House of Burke arrived in time and cut down several monsters at once in order to free the girl. Syria somehow managed to catch the falling stranger and abruptly sat down on the ground, holding her in her arms. The girl with pink hair screamed and asked for help and to get her out of here, and the blue-eyed girl tried to calm her down. The blue-eyed girl wanted to stroke the stranger's cheek to calm her down, but she noticed a lot of demonic energy on it that appeared from the touch of the monsters. Abigail, who had dealt with the monsters, called the lady and asked if she was okay. Hugging the lady, Syria said that she was not hurt, but that this girl was attacked by animals. The dark-haired woman asked if the lady would cleanse the demonic energy, and she was already leaning over the stranger, saying that she could not leave her like this. She thought about what she should concentrate on, raising her palm above the pink-haired lady's forehead. Suddenly, the demonic energy disappeared, although the blue-eyed girl barely had time to start, and she froze in surprise. The lady replied that the girl was fine now, and then asked what the other knights were doing, and Abigail replied that they were going around the plains to finish off the remaining monsters, and her husband had gone north. Syria said in fear that it was the most dangerous there, but the dark-haired girl asked her not to worry because Rush was the biggest danger here. Picking up her boot after the strange sensation, Evie called out to her mistress and said that she had never seen the ground turn black like that, and Syria muttered that something needed to be done. Carefully lowering the lady to the ground, the blue-eyed one bent down and placed her hands on the ground, confident that with this necklace her divine power had become many times more powerful. She realized that she could clear even such a large area, and exhaled, sifting the entire earth with light energy. Calling upon the holy saints, Abigail screamed, informing her mistress that everything around them had been cleared of the incomprehensible blackness. Touching her fingers to the necklace, Syria was convinced that it was this necklace that, in the right hands, had cleansed Laurel's estate. Lifting the ornament, she realized that this was the very reason why Lena always carried it with her in the original story. Frowning, the girl silently began to think about whether it was possible to call someone who relied on an extraneous object a saint. On their return to the Burke estate, Lennon met them and cried out admiringly that her ladyship and Mistress Abigail must be very tired. Looking away, the man said that he even cried when he learned that everyone had returned safe and sound, and the dark-haired girl said sarcastically that it gave her goosebumps. The blonde-haired man retorted that he was only glad that the mistress of the house had returned, and the blue-eyed woman folded her arms across her chest, asking if he was acting like that because she had personally removed half of the demonic energy. Lennon sniffed loudly and turned away, and Syria said with a grin that he wasn't even denying anything. The assistant said that it was truly amazing, because now not even a week would pass before the roads there would be used again, and the blue-eyed girl replied that it took some effort to achieve this. On the plains, the girl wanted to try to remove all the demonic energy at once, but she knew that if she hurried, there might be some mishaps. She looked out the window, thoughtful and even tired, and Lennon asked hesitantly if she would go to her quarters. Turning around, Syria said that if she had no more urgent and important matters, then she, of course, wanted to rest. Blue Eyes suddenly hit her forehead, crashing into someone who was walking in front of her, but Rush gently caught her by the waist, saying that he finally found her. The girl called his name, rubbing her forehead with her palm, and the man asked if she had a minute to discuss an urgent matter. Looking up and at her husband, she suddenly blushed brightly, although she was sure that in a week she would be able to calm down and forget about all the previous events. But as soon as he appeared opposite, Syria remembered how passionately they kissed and how he confessed his desire. Rush leaned down closer and said that he remembered how his wife had gone blank the last time he looked at her for more than a few moments. Making the girl blush, the Archduke said with a smile that she herself was now staring at him. Lennon and Abigail reacted differently emotionally to the unexpected family squabble that was revealed to them. The blonde man looked at his wife with pleasure and said that she could simply admit that she was enchanted by his beauty. Syria, not wanting to listen to any more embarrassing words, said that if this was his urgent question, then she would better go and turned around, but Rush caught her by the shoulder, promising not to tease her anymore. Gently stroking the girl's waist with his large palms, the man repeated that this was indeed important. When the blue-eyed girl asked what was the matter, the fair-haired man took out an envelope from his inside pocket, smiling and saying that it came from the imperial palace. The Archduke solemnly announced that their marriage had finally been legalized in the palace by the ruler himself. When the servants who came to their master's office at his request learned of this news, everyone reacted very positively. Rush carefully read every word of the letter given to him from the imperial palace. Bastian noted that the approval was given incredibly quickly. Usually, it takes at least a year to approve marriages of high-ranking nobles. Lennon suggested that the emperor had given his consent so quickly to avoid incurring the wrath of the House of Burke, and the red-haired girl asked him to speak of His Majesty more respectfully. The fair-haired man asked Miss Suzette if it was not important in the Burke lands to speak respectfully only of his lordship and lady, and she agreed. Lennon said he knew what the Archduke would do next, because he had witnessed Rush break the news to her grace the previous evening. Then he asked his wife if she liked the idea that next month they could go to their estate, which was located in the capital. Bastian asked about this in surprise, and Suzette said that the gentleman had never traveled anywhere in winter in his life, and refused to come even at the direct refusal of the emperor, justifying this by attacks by monsters. The servants immediately gathered in a dark circle and began to discuss the renovation of the estate, cleaning and retraining of the servants. Turning around, Suzette asked when they wished to go there, and the Archduke rubbed his forehead, saying he did not know. He added that he was not sure whether he would go, and Lenin cried out in surprise, saying that he had heard him with his own ears talking about the planned trip. Rush explained that this was only his wish, but Syria reacted very strangely to receiving approval for this marriage. She was upset and even seemed a little scared as she echoed his words of approval of the marriage. The servants, who knew the lady and her attitude towards her husband, stood around in surprise, looking at the fair-haired man while he was gloomily pondering this. Meanwhile, Abigail, holding a roast turkey thigh in her hand, found her friend and asked the lady why she was so sad. Syria, who was squatting, quietly greeted the dark-haired girl and asked what she was eating, and the girl replied that she had stolen some food from the kitchen. Sitting down next to the blue-eyed girl, the knight said that there was now a festive atmosphere throughout the entire estate due to the official recognition of this marriage. The Archduchess, sinking into her knees, confirmed that she was indeed married now, but Abigail asked her to share her troubling thoughts. Wrapping herself in a cloak, as if in a cocoon, the girl quietly said that she was simply afraid of marriage, because since yesterday, their union had ceased to be temporary. Syria added that she did not expect such a quick agreement and thought that she had a whole year, and Ibi asked in confusion why she was afraid of marriage. The dark-haired girl suddenly asked the lady if she still couldn't get that scoundrel out of her head. Blue-eyed muttered that she was thinking about him, but not in a romantic context, but remembering the horror that happened at her wedding. She whispered that she was probably afraid that in the future Rush might do the same as Callus did, preferring the saint. Suddenly rising with determination, Abigail asked the lady to wait for her here for a little while. When she drew her blade and declared that she needed to quickly cut Marquis Hannet's throat, the blue-eyed woman grabbed her around the waist and asked her not to do it. The dark-haired girl asked not to stop her, and the Archduchess explained that if she killed someone, she would never be released from prison. Understanding everything, Ebby muttered that this was why Syria avoided her husband, and the girl asked if this was too predictable. She exhaled and said that Rush should have realized this, because he was surprisingly good at reading her mind. Lenin then suggested that the couple have another wedding, adding that the capital could host such a celebration that the imperial family itself would envy their intelligence. The girl mentally panicked and touched her necklace with her fingers, thinking about what would happen when Lena returned to their world. Despite her efforts, the main plot remained unchanged, and all attempts to influence it were in vain. Blue Eyes thought with fear about what would happen to her if the man she married went to St. Lena, and whether she would be able to survive that again. Standing up, the girl muttered that she wasn't sure of anything right now, but thanked Abigail for listening and decided to think it over again. Suddenly, feeling a wide, strong hand on her shoulder, Syria turned around and was surprised to see Rush in front of her. She swallowed slightly, thinking about what he had heard, and hesitantly asked what her husband was doing here. Stretching out his hands to her, the fair-haired man calmly explained that he was again in great confusion. Putting his hand to his chest, the man desperately asked what he had done that was so terrible that he had managed to upset and disturb her. He explained that even when Hannet had raised the whole estate on its ears because of the saint, the girl did not stop coming here every day and checking the glacier. Rush added that the same thing was happening now, asking again what he had done wrong, and the blue-eyed girl looked at him with a little surprise. The blonde asked to at least share with him the reason so that he could beg for help, but the girl lowered her head, asking who he took her for. Covering her face with her hand, Syria said she was simply stunned by how quickly the emperor's permission for their marriage came. The man asked what the difference would be if they received it in a year, and the blue-eyed girl replied that the difference was simply huge. Unable to look at him and clutching her shoulder, the girl thought that in a year Lena would return to their world, and Rush would immediately marry her. Answering her husband's question about the reasons, she suddenly screamed, saying that their marriage was only temporary and they would have to get divorced. The fair-haired man asked, incomprehensibly, why they should part, and suddenly, with a completely broken look, suggested whether she needed this in order to return to the scoundrel Hannet. Syria asked irritably why he had brought up Callus, and Rush threw up his hands, saying that they no longer had any reason to break up. He asked her to stop considering their marriage temporary, because he didn't need anyone else as much as he needed her, and the blue-eyed girl folded her arms across her chest, asking if it was because of her status as stern. Overwhelmed with emotion and fear, the girl said how convenient it was, since his precious home needed her strength, adding that she would be more diligent in fulfilling her duties in the future. Shouting at his wife, the fair-haired man declared that she knew perfectly well what he meant when he said this. The blue-eyed woman objected that she did not understand anything at all and asked if he had really forgotten how they got married, saying that all this time he had lived with a sense of duty. Rush frowned and asked if she would leave when she thought she had paid, and Syria shouted that slaves who had paid their debt were free to go wherever they wished. Taking her hand in his own and pressing it to his lips, the fair-haired man asked where she could find a master who would be so concerned about the emotions of a slave. The man insisted that his wife's feelings were important to him, and not just important, but his top priority. Pushing his hands away from her, the blushing girl turned away and asked him to stop. She froze and opened her wide blue eyes when she heard Rush suggest that he feared the same ending to the relationship as with the Marquis of Hanet. The fair-haired man reminded her that the saint had disappeared, and when Syria objected that she could return at any moment, he asked if she was really worried that her husband might fall in love with Lena. He exhaled loudly and covered his face with his hand, and the blue-eyed girl thought that her husband was probably angry, because the girl continued to talk about divorce even after the emperor approved the marriage. Rush said that he was not the Marquis of Calais, and the blue-eyed girl quietly asked for forgiveness, but he stated that he did not need constant apologies, but she herself. The blonde man said that it didn't matter that she was stern and had been engaged to another man in her life. What was important was that she remained herself. Syria froze and blushed when the Archduke asked who he was to her, who she considered him to be. The girl thought that for her, he was the hero of a novel, whose love for the main character was stronger than anything in the world, and who tied the knot with the saint, and not with the villain. Putting his hand on his chest, the man asked her not to think of anything unnecessary, but to look at the person standing in front of her right now. When he said that her heart was important to him, the blue-eyed girl involuntarily remembered how they flirted with each other and joked. A thought came into her head about how he took care of her and saved her every single day, was there every time she needed help. With her wet eyes wide open and tears rolling down her cheeks, the girl said in a lost voice that she didn't know what she felt for him. When Rush took her face in his hands, Syria sobbed and quickly muttered that she definitely didn't hate him. The fair-haired man declared that this was enough for him for now, and leaned down, touching his lips to his wife's lips. She squeezed his hands softly and responded to such a nice and warm kiss as the tears dried on her flushed cheeks. Breaking away and stroking the girl's cold cheeks, the man affectionately noted that she was frozen. The blue-eyed girl exhaled, calming down, and whispered that she had simply been outside for a long time. Rush said that he would be very worried if Syria got sick, and therefore they should go somewhere warmer, and kissed her again when the girl agreed. A little later, they settled into their bathroom, climbing into the hot jacuzzi fully clothed so as not to embarrass each other right away. Brushing the hair from her face, the man said that she had that expression again and asked her not to say that she was thinking about that bastard Callus Hanet again. When Rush stroked the velvety skin on her neck with his fingers and pulled the girl closer to him for a kiss, but she whispered for him to wait. Without hiding his desire, the fair-haired man asked why, since he had already told her to tell him right away if she didn't want anything like that between them. Looking at her brightly reddened cheeks, the man added that it would not be possible to slip away like last time, because he would not stop. Pressing herself closer to his body, Syria stroked his hair and whispered that her reluctance was impossible, because she was now his wife. As they merged into a kiss, the blue-eyed girl thought about the fact that her doubts had not gone away, and she was still tormented by thoughts that Lena would return and change everything. Only now, everything had faded into the background, because she felt only the warmth of the Archduke, the heat of his body and soft lips. The girl looked into his bright red eyes, full of desire, and began to burn with it herself, trying to breathe evenly. Syria rested her forehead against his, and thought that Rush Burke, who had never been in that story, was now only here and only with her. Kissing him softly on the forehead, and then on the temple, the blue-eyed girl realized that the moment had come to admit a few simple things. Now the fair-haired man was not just a hero of a novel, distant from her, strict, gloomy, and inaccessible, but a husband who was going to make her his completely. Kissing the man again, the girl mentally agreed that he was the only person who understood her and cherished her more than anything in the world. A few days later, Syria arrived at the Burke estate in the capital, immediately amazed by its scale and beauty, and enthusiastically said that she had not been to the city for ages, and everything here was completely different from the Burke lands. Clenching her fists in glee, she said that there was no bone-chilling wind here at any time of year, and that spring was like spring. And Bastian smiled, asking if she really thought so. The girl said that every street here was majestic and dazzling, but when she entered the estate, she asked a little hesitantly why it seemed so deserted. Looking around, the blue-eyed woman said that there was practically nothing here, saying that it looked like thieves had been here, and Ebby immediately expressed her readiness to find and kill the culprit, but the lady shook her head. The butler explained that His Grace spent most of his time at his estate, so the residents in the capital looked a little abandoned, but the Archduchess could take